Today we're going to go through the basics of the TI-84 graphing calculator. Please follow along and fill in the worksheet that I have provided for you, as well as practice the things on the calculator as we come to them. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So the first thing is the layout of the calculator. So what I have pictured in your notes is the very top row of the calculator. And you'll see that the top row itself is in outline font. So if I go to the calculator, the way that you get to them is by hitting the second button, which is located in the top left. And then if I hit the y equals button, what will actually happen is I will get what's written above it. Okay, I will get the stat plot. Okay, if I just hit the button itself, then I get what the button says. Okay, so it's similar to the second function on any calculator that you've probably used. Okay. So what we're going to talk about here, what each of those buttons mean, what each of those buttons is used for, and just kind of how important they are to what we're going to do in this class. So the first one is the y equals button. And that one is used to enter equations for graphing. And this one happens to be very important. So for instance, if I want to enter the equation y equals 3x plus 2, I go to my calculator and I hit the y equals button, and then I simply put in 3x plus 2. So you'll notice that I now have this equation in my calculator, and I could then graph it, which we will get to in a second. The next button is the window button, and this, I just moved that. And this affects the display. This is another very important button. And we will talk more about the window in a little bit. But for now, notice that if I hit the window, I get this sort of screen. And again, we'll talk in a little bit about what that means. Next button is the zoom, and this allows you to zoom in and out. The most important feature of it is it allows you to easily return to the standard window. I'll say that this one is somewhat important. The next button is the trace. That allows you to move along the line. And we'll classify that one as mildly important. And then the graph button is the button you hit to actually display your graph. So this one is also very important. And notice what happens here. So from the y equals, right, if I go back to the y equals, there's my equation. In order to actually show what this equation is on the graph, I hit the graph button, and there it is. So now I have a picture of this line. And we'll get into a little more of that in a bit. Stat plot is for statistics. We will not use it. So for our purposes, it is not important. Table set just means the settings for the t-chart, and I would classify this as somewhat important. The format button is something you can use to turn the axes on and off. And I would say that that's not really all that important. I'll show you what I mean by that. So for instance, the format button is in blue, so I'm going to hit second format, and you get these different options, right? So if I want to turn the axes off, I would arrow down and then over, hit the enter button. Now the axes are off, so if I go back to my graph, I just see the line. I don't see the axes anymore. So there are some other things in the format menu that you can play around with, but for now I would just leave it as is. I'm going to turn the axes back on, go back to my graph and see that they're there, and we will continue. The Calc button, it allows you to analyze the graph. This is something you use a lot in your later math courses, but not something we will use a lot in here. So I will say it's mildly important. More so for later courses than now. And then the table actually shows your t-chart. And yeah, we'll say that that is an important one as well. So for instance, if I have this graph and I hit second table, you'll see that I have a t-chart, x values and y values. So yes, that's important as well. Okay, so moving on now. Let's talk about what makes a good graph. The first thing you want to make sure of are that you have the axes in view. Okay, so for instance, if I go to this graph, I can clearly see that I have both my x and my y axis. You want to be able to see your x and y axis. The next thing we want is we want the graph to kind of cover the full screen. Okay, so for instance, I don't want a graph, so if this is my window on my calculator, alright, and I have my axes here and here, I don't want the graph to just be displayed like in this little portion here. Okay, I'd like to cover the full screen. Alright, so I'd like to be able to change it, and we'll get into how we do that, so that it kind of looks something like this. Like that's better. It's covering the full screen. The next thing we want to make sure is that the tick marks on our axes are nicely spaced. Right, so if we go back to our graph here, okay, you notice the tick marks, how they're really, really nicely spaced. They don't look all jaggedy. We will see examples of how they can get kind of jaggedy, but right now these guys look pretty evenly spaced. So that's good. The next thing we want is we want our intercepts to be in view. So we want to see where the graph crosses both the y and the x-axis, which in this case, with this graph, it's already there. We can see where it crosses both axes, so that's good. And then finally, we want, and this isn't going to be too important for us because we're going to be graphing mostly lines, but we want to see all the major features, right? So for instance, if I started with a graph and it happened to be curvy and stuff, and if all I saw on my calculator was like this little piece here and then this little kind of thing here, that's not good enough because I really can't see what happens at the top of this graph. So what I would like to do is I would change my window so that instead of seeing only pieces of it, I would like to kind of be able to see, you know, the whole kind of graph. All right, and again, we're going to talk about how we fix this stuff. But these are the 5 things that make a good graph. All right, so it's important that you guys understand this checklist here. Okay, so when we're graphing, where do we start? What do we actually do? What are we looking for? What's going to make us a good graph, and how do we get going? So there's 4 things here. The first thing we need to do is we need to write the equation in y equals mx plus b form, so slope-intercept form. Because if you notice, when we go to the y equals button, that's the form it's expecting. All of those equations are y equals something. So we have to be able to convert it first. So notice the one that I put in was y equals 3x plus 2. That was already in slope-intercept form. The next thing you want to consider is, will the y-intercept be in view? Will I be able to see where this thing crosses the y-axis? The next thing to consider is, we're basically, once we have the y-intercept in view, we want to change the window so that we also get the x-intercept in view. So these aren't completely unrelated to what we talked about above. So these things are going to kind of relate to what makes a good graph up there. And then finally, after we got the intercepts in view, we also want to make sure that we adjust the window to get a good graph. And what do I mean by a good graph? Well, I mean all of these things up here, right? All of these things are what make a good graph. Okay? And down here are the 4 steps that we're going to kind of take to get that done. Okay. So, creating a good display window for a graph. So we talked a little bit about the window button. Now we're actually going to go in there and see what the window button does. Alright, so if I click here and I go to graph, you can see what our graph looks like now. If I go into the window button, you'll see you have X-min and X-max. And what happens is these control how much left and right. So these are the minimum X values and the maximum X values that you see. So if I go in there and I change that X max to, say, 50. And now I hit the graph. Notice what happened to my x-axis. Like, it looks like everything moved to the left. But that's because I now go from -10 to +50 on the x-axis. So in order for all of that to be seen on the screen, they kind of had to shrink things. Right. Now, we talked about the zoom button and what it can do. So if you notice, if you hit the zoom button and you look at number 6, it's the standard one. And what that'll do is that'll change your window back to the original. And the original window is from -10 to 10 on the x-axis and from -10 to 10 on the y-axis. All right. So for instance, if I go and I change the y-min to -25, and now I graph it, look what happened. All right, I now see more of the y-axis in the negative direction. Also, notice if I go in there and I change the y-min to 5, and I graph, notice what happens. I don't even see the x-axis anymore because I'm going from 5 to 10 on the y-axis. So let's get back to my standard window by hitting zoom 6. And now let's talk about these scales here. So the X scale basically says how much does each tick mark represent. Okay? So if I were to change that to 5, now every tick mark on the x-axis represents 5. So notice, to get from -10 to +10, I have a tick mark at -10, I have a tick mark at -5, I have 0 is where the y-axis is. Then I have a tick mark at positive 5 and a tick mark at positive 10. So each tick mark represents 5. That's what the x scale does. And the same for the y scale. So for instance, if I went and changed the y scale to 2, and now I graph it, notice that each of those tick marks on the y-axis represents 2. Okay, so I got negative 10, negative 8, negative 6, negative 4, negative 2, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Okay, so the last thing, the x-res and the delta x, we're not going to change those at all. We're just never going to bother with those. So the 6 things that you need to be concerned with are the x-min, the x-max, the x-scale, the y-min, the y-max, and the y-scale. So I'm going to zoom 6 to get back to our standard window, and there we are. So now we're actually going to practice graphing. Okay, so here we have our graph, y equals 1/3 x minus 11. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come into our calculator. We're going to go into the y equals. Okay, I'm going to clear out the one that's there by hitting the clear button. And then it is 1/3 x. So I'm going to do 1 divided by 3 x minus 11. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to graph it and see what happens. Okay, so clearly we can see this is not a good graph. I don't see my intercepts. I don't see the whole graph. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the y-min so that I get my axis in view. So I'm going to go to the window and I'm going to change the y-min to like negative 20. So now when I hit graph, look at that. I can now see where this thing crosses the axis. The problem is I don't see my x-intercept anymore. So maybe I need to change the x-max to go out to like 30. Let's just try 30. See what happens. Graph. Okay, still not in sight. So I'm going to go back to 40 now. So change that x-max to 40. Good. So now to get my graph to kind of cover the full screen, this is pretty good. But I could probably chop a little off the top by changing my y max to like 5. So if I change it to 5 and I hit graph, okay, now I got a little better thing. The issue here is now I pretty much got everything going on. I got my intercepts. I can see both axes. It covers the full screen. The problem is my tick marks look a little kind of not so neat. So that's where I'm going to go in and I'm going to change my x scale. Maybe if we did them every 2, and then I did my y scale to every 2, maybe we'll get a better looking graph. Let's see. That looks much better. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go back into our window. So we're first going to sketch this graph. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is go in here and sketch this graph in this box here. So I basically had my axes here. They looked like this, and then this line kind of went like this. Okay, so there's the sketch. And then the other thing I'm going to do is come in here and copy down what my window values are. So if I go into my window, I'm going to copy these down. So x min is negative 10. X max was 40. X scale is 2. y min was -20, y max is 5, and the y scale is 2. All right, and that's what you would be expected to do. So you're going to do the rest of those on your own, and you can check where the notes are posted for the rest of the answers and kind of compare. So the next thing we want to talk about is some of the things we can do with our graphs, the variations that we can do. So if we want to do like shading and stuff, here's where we'll do it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to graph each of these equations separately. So I'm first going to change them to y equals form, because that's what I need to do. So I got 2y equals -3x plus 12. So y equals -3/2 x plus 6. So that's going to be my one equation. My other equation is going to be -2y equals -x plus 4. Divide by -2, and I will get 1/2 x minus 2. So I'm going to go and graph those. I'm going to put those in to here. So I'm first going to go into y equals. I'm going to clear out that one, and I'm going to put my first equation in, negative. Here's the negative button. It's not the same as the minus button, right? So if I want a negative number, I use that button there. So -3/2 divided by 2 x plus 6. And then I'm going to go down to y2, and I'm going to put in my other one. And the other one is 1/2 x minus 2. And then I'm gonna make sure that I graph these in a standard window. So there's one line, there's the other. Now, if we go back and we look, we notice that these are not equal signs. Okay, my first one is actually comes out to be y less than or equal to -3/2 x plus 6. So I'm going to want to go in there and make sure that I use a less than or equal sign. So this is what we do. We go into our y equals menu, and we arrow over to the far left. Once we're there, we just hit enter, and it changes. So that's a thick line, that's a greater than, and that's a less than. So now when I graph it, it's shaded in below that line, the less than line, right? So if I go back to my other line, this one started, and then when we divide by -2, we have to switch the sign, so this is a less than. So I'm going to go back to my graph, I'm going to go into y equals, I'm going to arrow down to y2, I want that equation, I'm going to go left, I'm going to hit enter until I get the less than sign, and then I'm going to graph. And you will see that it's shaded for both equations. And so that's that. So now I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to slide this over because I want to sketch my graph. So I just want to be able to look at it. So I'm going to go into here, and I have my axes, which are here and here. The one line is coming up like this, and we have shaded below that one. The other line's coming in like this, and we have shaded below that one. So you will see that the overlapping area is a little darker. darker. So we will shade all of that in as well. Nice and dark. Okay, so the only thing that's left to do is write in my window values. So I'm going to go back here, click on window. I'm pretty sure it was the standard. So it should just be x min -10, x max +10, the x scale is 1, the y min is -10, the y max is 10, and the y scale is 1.